Chapter 2. The Ludhiana Express thundered past. Full of joy, Sundar rose from his knees. "Father, father, wake up! I must talk to you!" Sundar rushed into his father's room and roused him. "Listen, father, I have seen Jesus Christ. He is alive." Sher Singh turned over sleepily. What was the boy saying? "I have seen Jesus, father. I am a Christian." Sundar's father sat up. "What are you talking about? It's only 3 days since you burned their book. You're overexcited. Go back to bed." Sher Singh lay down again and closed his eyes. The boy must have been dreaming. "It was just a dream, Sundar," said one of the family the next day when he tried to explain. "You have been reading too late at night. We've always said you shouldn't. You ought to rest a bit more. You will make yourself ill, Sundar, if you go on like this." "You're a Sikh, Sundar. Are you mad, believing what those Christians at the school tell you?" So his family persuaded and reasoned. "I am now a Christian," Sundar insisted again and again. To his family it now became apparent that Sundar meant what he said. The shame and disgrace of it, that one of their family, a family respected for miles around, should turn his back on the faith of his fathers and take up with these Christians. Christianity wasn't for Indians. It was the Europeans' religion. How could Sundar be so disloyal? The tide of their anger swept against Sundar, but he held his ground. It was not easy to endure the reproaches, the stunned disappointment of his father, the bitter anger of his brother. The hostility would have been easier to bear had Sundar not cared so deeply for his family and its Sikh traditions. Sundar became the talk of Rampur. The situation became even more acute when 3 other Sikh boys, fellow pupils with Sundar at the American Presbyterian Mission School, joined him in saying they wished to receive Christian baptism. Strong and immediate parental opposition brought 2 of them to heel, yet the resentment of the village against the school grew daily in fervor. The headmaster, the Reverend E. P. Newton, was brought before the local magistrate and accused of putting undue pressure on his pupils. Sundar testified in his headmaster's defense. "My decision to become a Christian was mine alone. I have received the direct revelation of Jesus the Lord." It was a hard, lonely time for Sundar Singh. Still only 15 years old, he had to face the hostility both of his family and the local community. In addition, by embracing the Christian faith, he felt he had brought about the rampant anti-Christian spirit in the village. Indeed, the hue and cry which followed upon Sundar's conversion forced the school to close, and many Christians left the district. Gurdit Singh, the other Sikh boy who had become a Christian, had been baptized at Khana, a mission center about 200 miles along the railway line towards Ludhiana. Gurdit's father went to Khana and persuaded his son to return to Rampur by telling the boy that his mother was ill. Soon after he reached home, Gurdit became very sick and died. His family, rather than bear the disgrace of a Christian in the family, had apparently poisoned his food. When news of this tragedy reached Sundar, he was made to realize how afresh how intense Sikh feelings were against his new faith. Although his school had been forced to close down, its former headmaster, Mr. Newton, continued to befriend Sundar. He was anxious to ensure that Sundar should continue his education in a Christian school. Fortunately, there was a Christian boys' boarding school at Ludhiana, and arrangements were made for Sundar to become a boarder there. No doubt Sher Singh was not altogether sorry to see his son leave Rampur for a while, even though the school's Christian tradition would have displeased him. The Presbyterian missionary teachers, Dr. Wary and Dr. Fife, welcomed Sundar warmly. Yet despite the friendliness with which he was received, Sundar nonetheless felt ill at ease in this new and unfamiliar environment. The staff were largely English-speaking, and Sundar knew little English. His recent experiences and his thoughtful, introspective disposition tended to isolate him from the other boys. Worst of all, he was deeply aggrieved to see how casually some of them appeared to regard their Christian faith. Within weeks, Sundar made the decision to return home, in the hope that the turmoil in Rampur had quietened in his absence. Initially, the welcome he received in Rampur was encouraging. "Sundar has come home. Doubtless he's come to his senses at last," they thought. These expectations were short-lived, for Sundar's return had not been occasioned by any renunciation of the Christian faith. On the contrary, his Christian resolve had never been stronger. The cajoling and threatening began once more. Behind the scenes, his family worked on a new ploy. An uncle, a man of considerable wealth, invited Sundar to his home. On arrival, he took Sundar down to the cellar and locked the door behind them. Sundar, somewhat alarmed, recalled the fate of his friend Gurdit Singh. Had his own family a similar murderous intent? He eyed his uncle apprehensively as he moved towards a heavy iron safe. He opened the door to reveal a profusion of money and jewelry. His uncle smiled kindly and said, "You may have all this, Sundar, on condition you remain within the religion of your fathers." Sundar could not help but be flattered by his uncle's generosity and by the depth of feeling that prompted it. "No, uncle, I cannot," he said softly. "You must allow me to follow the truth as I see it." As we have seen, it was not only his family but also the wider community of the village who took strong exception to his newfound faith. Households in the village ostracized him. His mother had been locally revered as a bhakta, that is, someone who was acknowledged as having religious insight and perception of a high order. This made her son's behavior appear even more incomprehensible in the eyes of the people. When Sundar walked down the street, backs were turned and fists shaken in his face. Nonconformity then, as ever, roused fear and suspicion. One local character, Ramat Ullah, appears to have been notably aggressive. The incident is recounted of how he found Sundar early one evening seated in the shade of a tree, engrossed in his New Testament. Ramat leaned over him, his eyes wild and angry, snatched the New Testament and hurled it away. "That's what I think of that," he blustered, and cuffing Sundar he hurried away, anxious to tell his tale to Sundar's family. A day or so later, Sundar came upon a crowd standing outside Ramat's house. "Ramat," he was told in hushed tones, "is critically ill and is dying of cholera." On an impulse, Sundar asked if he could see him, and was taken to Ramat's bedside. The sick man looked at Sundar with wild, staring eyes. He was in a weak and semi-delirious condition and spoke feverishly of devils who were coming to get him. "There is one who might save me, but I dare not call him," he whispered. "Who do you mean? Who is the one?" said Sundar. "Your guru," sobbed Ramat, and moments later he died. Despite Sundar's intransigence, the family did not slacken their efforts. What other inducement could they devise to get him to alter course? A cousin, Spuran Singh, invited him to stay with him at Nabha, where Spuran Singh had an influential post in the service of the Maharaja. Although this was, of course, during the period of British rule in India, the local princes or Maharajas still had considerable power. Their loyalty to the crown during the period of the Indian Mutiny had been rewarded by guarantees of territorial rights, and they now shared with the British the government of their states. The Maharaja was therefore a much respected person, and Sundar was naturally alarmed when Spuran Singh told him that the Maharaja wished to see him. With all his authority, the Maharaja appealed to Sundar not to dishonor the Sikhs. He held out the offer of a promising career in his employ. Such a chance would have tempted any Sikh boy, but Sundar politely, yet resolutely declined it. It was now abundantly clear that Sundar Singh had a single-minded commitment to Christ. His family decided to play their last card. "It is obvious to us, Sundar, that you are obsessed with your newfound faith. It seems you will sacrifice almost anything in pursuit of it. This we respect, but in the interests of your family who love you dearly, will you make one concession?" Sundar had no desire needlessly to alienate them. "What is it you want?" "Keep your faith secret, a private matter between your God and yourself." Momentarily, Sundar faltered, but no. To agree to this would be to strike at the heart of the gospel. Sundar shook his head. "I am sorry, but I cannot agree to such a thing." From that time on he knew, and his family knew, that he was lost to them. As a final gesture he took a pair of scissors and cut off his long black hair. As the Sikhs are bound by their religion to allow their hair to grow freely, Sundar's act was an outward and visible sign that he had turned his back on his old allegiance. His father was incensed. "You cannot stay within my house a moment longer. You must leave tonight." He was hungry, he was cold, he huddled for shelter under a tree in the outskirts of the village. He had nothing but the clothes he had been wearing and his copy of the New Testament. He thought of the home he had left, warm and comfortable, and until today, friendly. Now he was shivering, faint from lack of food, and worst of all, humanly speaking, he was friendless. Yet he felt a great sense of peace that night. The peace born of a good conscience. It was, he said later, my first night in heaven. A major battle had been fought and won. By God's good grace he had been enabled to stand firm for his master. When the morning light came, he got to his feet and walked to the railway station at Rampur. The moment had come when he must leave behind him his home and village, the familiar houses, the dusty streets, the trees where he and his friends had played and gossiped, the Hindu temple which held the memories of his mother. All these belonged to earlier days. No more could he call them home. A new life was beckoning to him, although he perceived only dimly what its shape might be. He hurried on, leaving his childhood behind him. Sundar Singh, tall and well-built for his age, had reached his manhood. He was not yet 16, but in India young men develop more rapidly than their European counterparts, and Sundar's particular experiences and determined character had wrought in him maturity and independence. He reached the railway station. What now? Where? The Christians who had fled from Rampur at the time of Sundar's conversion were now settled at Rupar, a town 150 miles to the northwest. Sundar knew they would welcome him. He had just sufficient money for his fare. The train drew out of Rampur. Sundar sat back in his seat. He could no longer ignore a pain in his stomach that had been troubling him since early that morning. Sundar told himself it was a cramp brought on by his cold, uncomfortable night. Though he tried not to think of it, his mind kept recalling his friend Gurdit Singh and the fate he had suffered. As the pain intensified, the thought of Gurdit's death clamored for recognition. Had he driven his family to act in a similar way? To Sundar, the journey to Rupar seemed interminable. When at last the train pulled into Rupar station, he struggled out of the carriage and laboriously made his way to the home of the pastor, the Reverend P. C. Uppal, and his wife. He reached the doorstep only just in time, collapsing minutes later in their living room. The boy was obviously very ill, and Mr. Uppal called a doctor at once. Sundar was right in his suspicions. He had indeed been poisoned, and was fortunate to have survived the journey. "There is nothing I can do, Mr. Uppal," the doctor told the pastor. "The boy will soon die, I fear. I will not give him any medicines, for there is no prospect of recovery, and his relatives will only complain that my medicines killed him. I will come back tomorrow morning, and we will arrange the funeral." Just before leaving, the doctor looked in again at Sundar and found that he had regained consciousness. He bent down and to hear what the boy said. "Would you please read to me?" Sundar indicated the New Testament by the bed. "St. Mark, chapter 16, please." It was the account of Christ's resurrection. The doctor read it to indulge his dying patient, but could not refrain from pointing out what a ridiculous story it seemed to him to be. He left, expecting that Sundar would be dead by nightfall. Sundar lay there, watched over by Mrs. Uppal. Not for a moment did he believe he was going to die. Surely God still had work for him to do in this life. As his prayers upheld him through the night, slowly his strength returned. In the morning, a smiling Mrs. Uppal helped him sit up in bed. By midday he had recovered sufficiently to sit outside in the afternoon sunshine. As he rejoiced in his recovery, Sundar caught sight of the doctor arriving. The doctor's face as he walked across to Sundar was a study in itself. The corpse he had expected was very much alive and smiling broadly. This incident had its sequel, for several years later Sundar, on a preaching tour in Burma, met that same doctor again. "Do you recognize me?" said the doctor. "Yes," said Sundar. "The last time I met you I was at death's door." The doctor then told him that he had been astonished to see Sundar sitting up in the garden, having made so miraculous a recovery. It had sent him back with renewed curiosity to the pages of the New Testament. "I was baptized 2 years later," he told Sundar, "and I'm now working in Burma as a missionary doctor." That doctor was the first of many, for whom an encounter with Sundar Singh led to an encounter with Christ. Such was the quality of his life, the strength of his faith, that people who met him were stopped in their tracks, made to think, and often the whole direction of their lives was altered. Even as a young boy of 15, sick and helpless, there was something about his bearing and determination that spoke to the doctor. When Sundar was fit enough to travel, it was decided he should return to the boarding school at Ludhiana for the summer term. Sundar's longing was to be baptized, but he could not take this step without his father's permission, until he was 16 years old, and that would not be until the 3rd of September 1905. His father, Sher Singh, discovered that Sundar was at Ludhiana, and he, together with the other members of the family, arrived unexpectedly at the school, intending to force Sundar to return with them. Frustrated in their attempt to kill Sundar by poisoning, they approached the school in a spirit of angry determination. Wisely, the school authorities allowed only Sher Singh to see Sundar. The rest of the family were persuaded to leave the precincts and return home. It was a painful scene, for between father and son lay the knowledge that there had been the abortive poison attempt. One more, his father pleaded with him to return. Past grievances would be forgotten if Sundar would relinquish Christianity. Sundar had fought and overcome that particular temptation weeks ago, and now even the sight of his father's tears could do nothing to change his mind. Disappointed, Sher Singh changed his tactics. He lost his temper and became abusive. "You will not continue to disgrace your family and myself," he shouted. "We failed once, but we shall find a way to bring this nonsense to an end." With this veiled threat, Sher Singh concluded the interview. Dr. Fife, the headmaster, was anxious to shield Sundar from further harassment by his family. Accordingly, he recommended that Sundar should take refuge at Sadhu, where the American Presbyterian mission that ran the Ludhiana school also had a hospital for the treatment of lepers. "I'm very sorry to lose you, Sundar, but the risks will be less at Sadhu. If you remain there until you are 16, then you can be baptized." The tranquility of the hospital at Sadhu was a welcome relief after those turbulent 9 months since his conversion. Free from hostility and recrimination, Sundar read and reread the New Testament and prepared himself for baptism in the relaxed and gentle atmosphere of Sadhu. It became for him a symbol of quiet and rest, and when ill health prompted the need for a permanent base later in his life, it was in Sabathu that he bought a house. Sabathu lies amongst the lower ranges of the Himalayas, 1,000 feet below the town of Simla, which held memories for him of childhood summer holidays. Sabathu is a beautiful town with wide views over the valleys across to wooded hills. Simla can be seen in the distance. Pine forests reach down to the boundaries of the leper hospital. The Punjab plains lie shimmering in the heat to the south and west, while in the opposite direction tower the majestic Himalayas, their snow-crowned peaks alluring yet daunting. Beyond them lay Tibet. Increasingly, Sundar's thoughts were to turn in that direction. Tibet was a mysterious land, closed to the world outside. Since the country had succumbed to Chinese rule at the end of the 18th century, foreigners had been unwelcome. It was a nation held together by its strong Buddhist faith, and ruled by the Buddhist lamas, at that time notorious for their ignorance and cruelty. China's power and influence were temporarily to wane, but the policy of isolation persisted. The Tibetans had never forgotten the prophecy of a Buddhist saint who had foretold an invasion of their land and the consequent overthrow of their established religion. The lamas were therefore most anxious to keep all foreign influence at bay, and were particularly fearful of Christianity and other alien faiths. The physical terrain of Tibet greatly aided them in their efforts to shut out the rest of the world. Only the most persevering visitor would be inclined to rackle the dangerous mountain routes and the bitter climate. Even that part of Tibet known as Lesser Tibet, or the border of Tibet and under British rule, was just as hostile to the outsider. Sundar looked towards the mountain passes that led to that land, and his heart went out to a people who had never so much as heard the name of Jesus Christ. September approached, and with it Sundar's 16th birthday. Arrangements were made for his baptism. Dr. Fife of the Ludhiana School wrote a letter of introduction to an Anglican priest, the Reverend J. Redman of the Church Missionary Society at Simla. He told him of Sundar's story and of his deep yearning for baptism. Happy that he was soon to be granted his greatest wish, Sundar eagerly made his way to Simla to meet Mr. Redman and his wife. There was an immediate rapport between them. Their meeting marked the beginning of a long-standing friendship. For Sundar, who had no settled home, it was reassuring to know that at the Redmans a room was always ready for him. Mr. Redman wrote later of their first meeting, "I was deeply impressed by his sincerity. I examined him carefully and asked him a great many questions about the chief facts of the gospel. Sundar Singh replied to my entire satisfaction, and he evinced that even then an extraordinary knowledge of the life and teaching of Christ. Then I inquired into his personal experience of Christ as his Savior. Again, I was more than satisfied, and I told him I would be very glad to baptize him on the following day, which was a Sunday." Why it was that Sundar was baptized by a Church of England priest at Simla rather than by a minister of the American Presbyterian mission at Sabathu is not entirely clear, but it was probably a matter of simple convenience. It seems likely that there was no resident minister at Sabathu, and fortunately Mr. Redman was near at hand. At that time, denominational distinctions meant little to Sundar, and this remained so for the rest of his life. More than perhaps any other Christian leader of his generation, he demonstrated a faith which was free from sectarian preoccupations. Thus, on his 16th birthday, Sunday, 3rd of September, 1905, Sundar Singh was baptized at St. Thomas's Church, Simla. The opening words of the 23rd Psalm during his baptism were an apt commentary on both his past and his future. "The Lord is my shepherd, therefore can I lack nothing."